So our source of energy, we all know this as the sun. It is our firm belief that the fate of civilization, our cities and architecture, is dependent on how we can sustain our ever-growing appetite for energy, especially now since we passed peak oil. We take for granted that we all have to, regardless of our opinions and preferences, to address the environmental impact of our work as architects, considering that the act of building is responsible for around 40% of our emissions of greenhouse gases. In order for us to work, for our work to have an impact on the environment, we really need to address our cities. To live and dwell is the pillar of our civilization that radically needs to evolve in order for us to come to terms with our environmental predicament. So this year we are actually interested in looking in future forms of living. So we're going to start from a different scale this year. We need not, for the first time, radical visions for altering our built environment. Maybe sometimes frightening visions for the future. But we would like to embrace a level of ignorance, no fear of failure, and risk as the way forward in engendering novel design propositions capable of transforming our civilization's relationship to the national environment, energy, and our resources. Just like Stephen Chu, the green technology race is the space race over time. I think we very much believe in this. Although dealing with a negatively charged content, we are not interested in the negativity, but we want to promote the optimism, energy, and creativity that arise from working on design in an experimental, speculative, and projective architectural discourse. And we hope to contribute to our discipline in this way. We are looking for optimism, human enterprise, and belief in the transformative capacity of architecture for new designs to emerge. The pedagogy aims to help demystify architecture and attempts, as in the case of Seschi Pompeii in Sao Paulo, to make a real difference. We would like to engender these interesting but blunt future world illustrations from DEFRA with a hope and optimism of design. We would like to propose for a change that design and architecture, our physical environment, can have an effect on our situation. So this year, we're going to go back to this global scenario group diagram, and we're going to look at what's referred to as great transitions. So we're going to look at eco-communalism and new paradigms, especially relating to future living. The fear of the environment is not something new. It's been around for a while. And the slow development, because of misconstrued idea of conflict between green technology and solutions and building cost. We actually think this is a fallacy. We think we have to change our environment. We have to look at new opportunities in the way we go about designing architecture. So we are Deep 16. I am Jonas, and this is Andrew. We are both part of a practice called Urban Future Organization. I'm going to show a little bit more of that later on. This year's brief is titled Metatropolis, and it's about future forms of living. And it is about believing in what you're doing. This is a picture of Paolo Soleri, which is a figure that we will be looking at quite closely this year. And I think what's interesting here, he was an architect, regardless what you think about his ideology, that has true faith in what he could do and what difference his work could do. This is not about ideology itself, but it's about the unwavering belief in ideas. You know this guy, Leonardo, the Renaissance man, the guy who can do everything. We don't necessarily endorse that model, but we also don't want practice to become this old version of practice. But we need to look for new forms of practice, new forms of collaboration, finding ways of working with other experts. in coming to terms with our changing environment. This is the IPCC working document that just were released recently, and it's quite clear now that mankind is responsible for climate change. In order to get to this result, it's a very, very complex process. And we're going to be discussing complexity in relationship to Deep 16, which is quite central. And one of the main things that actually drive our effect on the environment is its overpopulation. So the world is filling up, cities are growing bigger and bigger, and we need to find things to do about how we live. The UN Habitat looked for new types of housing. I think what they were interested in doing was to challenge the conventional ways that we actually build today. I refer to this as the kind of global vernacular of concrete blocks and tin roofs. And in order for us to do something about our environmental impact, we need to look for other ways of building, planning, and making it attractive for the people who actually would like to live in our environments. So we're going to start looking a little bit at cities. We're going to look at new ideas that has been done before. This is Pianesis, Campo di Marzio in Rome. We have Harvey Willie Corbett's City of the Future, Helmut Jacobi, Milton Keynes, Frank Lloyd Wright, Broadacre City. And we're going to go back and look at the cities. And here we have Paolo Soleri's comparison of its arcology with traditional forms of urban development. We're going to go back and look at these types to see what they do. We're going to look at these visionary projects, quite a few projects from Paolo Soleri, and other architects. He worked with new ideas of living with our environment. Here's Buckminster Fuller, and you see archigram, and ways we can actually relate this to our biomes, to our climate, to find smarter ways of disseminating information about the environment, to have a conversation with other people, to talk about new technology. And we know some of the recent results, like Master City by Fosters and Partners, which tries to create these new types of city. I think this is not really a fully working model yet, and we have other practices that look for some type of green aesthetic. But I think these don't go far enough in trying to understand what it takes for us to change paradigm, to go to something that we're going to call regenerative design. Basically, that our built environment needs to have a positive outcome on our environmental predicament. So in order to do this, I think we're looking for future vision versus proven technology. We hope to engender a certain level of optimism in architectural discourse filled with despair and cynicism. We believe in the projective and transformative power of good design in our environments and what it actually can do to our situation. So, we're going to be looking at this that we call regenerative design, that we started on before. How can our design environment give back more to society than it takes? And we're going to start doing this by looking at reading a book which is called The Collapse of Complex Societies by Joseph A. Tainter. He looks at civilization in relationship to energy. So basically, what happens when a civilization runs out of energy, civilization gets more and more complex, then what normally happens is that you go through a collapse of some sort when we go back to simpler forms. This may or may not happen to us. Most civilizations before us didn't see it coming, but it was always connected to an idea of energy and resources. We're going to start looking at this article in The New Scientist. We're going to read the book by Joseph Tainter. We're going to then also have a look at a critical take on Joseph Tainter and what he's saying, and to find ways of actually recreate an idea of regeneration. So his diagram is quite simple, really. He basically believes that if we keep working towards the growth, to actually find more and more, consume more and more, and expanding our society more and more. We're going to overreach at some stage, and at some point that means that we're going to self-destruct, or we're going to go back down. Or we might need to find another way of thinking about how we build. And the way we want to do this, we want to go back to the very basic for our civilization in that way, to look for new types or future living types. So we're going to actually go back and looking at how you live and how that impacts the environment, and how we can actually do this attractive for people who are going to live in our built environment. These problems are obviously very complex. This is just a tree from the Leeds assessment tool. We're going to be working on this during the year. We're going to have a lead and a BREEAM assessor with us who's going to be seeing what we can use these tools for, to use them as a vehicle for design or for discovering new opportunities. But when we invent more legislation, more regulations, more layers, our work becomes more complex. It becomes quite difficult to deal with. Sometimes it adds value, sometimes it actually takes something away. And this is exactly what Joseph A. Tainter discusses in his book. So, what can we do with our cities and the way we live in the future to affect climate change? We can look at buildings, we can look at energy, we can look at control systems, transport, waste, water, and planning. But we can also look at how we live, or future forms of living, which is basically what we're going to try to do this year. We're going to go from how you inhabit and how you live, and how you make it attractive, and what type of effect that can have on a larger idea of the city and the environment. When we see this diagram here, we realize that the new buildings we make, the certified buildings we make, have a very small, it's a very small part of the building stock we have in the world. So those few things we do, they really need to make a big difference if you're going to get anywhere. And we are actually interested in pursuing an architecture that gives back more to the environment than it costs. And we're going to do this year as opposed to last year when we look at more of cities as design projects. We're going to look at it from the scale of inhabitation, life, and future ideas for living as a start. Okay, we are interested then in this case to bring people, nature, and technology together so we can discuss questions of ecology, economy, and culture. We're going to look at different types of complexity in how you make and how you design something on small scale. So our project, again, for the first part of the brief, we're going to work on a small scale. We're not necessarily making a dwelling, we're not making housing, but we're looking at future living. And in order to think about living and how that can affect things, we have to think about energy. And as we know, the more evolved the society becomes, the more energy it actually consumes, the larger its ecological footprint gets, so it will take more space. And we can find different ways of doing this. We can either devolve the amount of technology we use, or we need to find another way of understanding how we use energy. And today we know this, the more we refine energy, the more energy gets lost on the way. So we want to be able to look at energy in relationship to material, but also how we power things, and how we can work with renewable energies to find other ways of working on homes or on living. Innovation is something else which is important, because we very much believe this. This is something called the IPAT equation, which basically means that the environmental impact is the technology, population, and affluence combined. The only thing we can really affect here, affluence, might flatten out, we don't know. Population is going to keep growing. But what we can do is that we can work with technology proactively. So we can look at assemblies, the way we think about future living, how we build our inhabited places, how we think about materials and fabrication. So future living is basically then what we're going to start with. We're going to look at, this is a little bit new for us because we haven't been working from this scale before. We do in practice, but we haven't done it in the unit. So maybe the examples are not perfect because they've been looking more at the city down to the unit. So we are looking much more on what's happening in these places, how do you inhabit them, how do you kind of define architectural qualities, how do you think about sustainability, how do you think about energy, waste, resources, and other ideas of sustainability that deals with public space, with social inclusion, and so on. So we're going to try to work on a much smaller scale when we get closer to the architecture, and then we're going to project outwards. Materials is something else that is bound to affect our environment. So this is going to be an integral part of the whole brief. So we're going to be looking at new types of material, new forms of construction. This is a student some time back, and new technology. We do this through a thesis-driven research. So we want you to define what you want to do in the context of the unit. So we very much believe in self-initiative, autonomy. We support you with providing training, coaching, managing, all those other things around, but you actually define your own agenda within the platform that we build for you. So the kind of research brief, it's something that goes in parallel with the design work you do in the units. So you will carry a research thread throughout the year, and part of that research would be to look at precedent studies, different ways of actually drawing, and different types of projects to look at. Here are some student work from last year, working very much with drawing. So we're going to work on few larger scale drawings. And then this year, we're very much going to look at models and maybe some larger scale output. So most of your work throughout the year will actually be about physical models that will be built on different scales, that will be tested, appraised, and then reiterated again. So we have a pretty simple setup for how this is done. And we very much think that a gauge of the success in the unit is basically how you gauge the physical output that comes out of it, comes out of the work. So technical studies, I think unfortunately this will tell you something slightly wrong. We are most likely going to do TS option 1 because we're going to use our early design to do an environmental appraisal. We're going to look at BREEAM and LEEDs. We're going to have an expert coming in to work with you on these to see what this could be used for design. But we're still going to make models. We're going to test things in model. For TS, we very much would like to see this models that you experiment on and that you produce for the end. We also look at external consultancy. So I think that's another thing that we do for you, to bring in your own consultants, that you write a research abstract, you present yourself as a researcher, you find ways of tapping into other types of knowledge as well. And that is in addition to the TS. I think this usually gives valuable input for TS. Okay, this is what we've done in the past. We have done these, and we are now actually in a different cycle. It's going to come later on, which it's this new brief. Fourth years are going to look at London. We're going to look again out in the Thames estuary, where we strongly suggest that you'll be working on these sites, tapping into infrastructure, tapping into lots of the sites, the brownfield sites out in the estuary, and there's lots of interesting context to work on. 5th years, on the other hand, are very welcome to come for a conversation. So we very much entertain the idea that you can go to whatever site you want to do, but at the same time you have to make use of the brief that we have in place. So it's very easy. You can actually come in for a chat if you have something you want to do. So this is what we're going to do. This is the undertaking. We're going to develop a future living prototype. This is basically the first thing we are working on. And we're going to work on this prototype reiteratively. So you're going to work the same model over and over again. We have a few simple deliverables in the unit. So you have books, you have certain key documents that you've got to do, but that you can spend most of your time on actually the models you make. So there's a slight difference between the fourth year and final years. So we go from future living to novel architectonic prototypes to Metatropolis in the fourth year. So it's a pretty simple cycle of exercises. So final year, I think we need to be, we're going to put a little bit more restrictions on you. We're going to look much more on the information that informs your project, so you can actually define a stronger thesis, and you can, you also need to tap into the fact that it's connected to infrastructure. We are going to, anyway, so the brief you can have a look at. So there's a clear set of deliverables in order to keep things simple. So this is what we've done in the past. This is our first year in this fourth cycle called Regenerative Evolution. And we're now going to look at future living in a different way. We are going to go on a trip. It's probably going to be in connection to Christmas. You can have a look at this timetable. It will also be available at the interviews. You can actually see this. And then we're going to go on something which should probably be called a Deep 16 living adventure or something instead. But we're going to first go and see some blunt, boring, sometimes boring, and maybe less ambitious projects around London that have been trying to work with these scenarios we're discussing, but in a very hands-on way. Then we are going to go to Arizona, New Mexico, and southern Colorado, where we're going to first see an amazing environment. I mean, you know what you can find here. But we're going to look at one of these societies that actually went through a collapse. And these are the Chaco Indian society. It's one of the the civilizations that Joseph Tainter wrote about in his book. It was very much an urbanized society that grew beyond its reach. You can still find many of these things intact, but obviously the civilization itself is gone. And they actually lived in pretty large cities, or very dense cities. They were more like big buildings with different rooms, more like the arcology that Paulo Soleri is looking at than individual buildings. We're also going to go to Taliesin West, Frank Lloyd Wright's winter home, which is also a form of it's a form of utopia, dystopia, I don't know. I mean, it's a form of a closed community that is interesting to visit. Then we're going to go to the most remarkable place ever, I think, if you can call a city with about 30 people, an urban laboratory, but we're going to go and see it. So we're going to go and see Paolo Soleri's Arco Santi, and there are not that many people living there, but I think what we find interesting with him is that he really did what he believed in. So he actually started the construction of this thing, which was going to be his arcology. And now we're going to go there, we're going to see lots of the other activities around. There are other people building things like earth ships and so on around. And then we're going to do the Arco Santi workshop. When you actually get to experience Arco Santi, you get to work there for 5 days to learn the philosophy and the way of working of Paolo Soleri and his Arco Santi project. It's not, we don't do this because we endorse his ideology or whatever, but I think it's very interesting because he vehemently believed in what he was doing, and you can see that also in his followers, that they believe that these ideas are right. So today maybe we can call it dystopia, we can call it other things, but I still think the experiment is quite interesting, and the fact that you dare to believe in something. And we're going to go to the Paolo Soleri Museum, see lots of his drawings, models, and so on that are pretty amazing stuff. They're very big, at least. Design varies, but at least he tried, and he really went for it, which is something we very much endorse. So this is what we're going to learn there. At Arcosanti, when we are done with that, we're going to go to the Biosphere project, Biosphere 2. We're going to be looking at environments and how we can live within an environment, how we can garden an environment. So we think this is a pretty exciting trip. It's very much integrated and connected to what we want to do. This is Andrew, my colleague. He likes to spend, he has lots of patience, so he spends lots of time with you. I'm more of a generalist, so I talk more on the, talk quickly and fleetingly, whereas Andrew is the one who has patience for everything. So some crits, some events from last year. And again, the fact that we try to do this, we try to test design, we try to work through these projects as architecture, that you will have an architectural output, good or bad, it doesn't matter so much as long as you try things. I think this is what we want to engender, because actually most interesting research is actually failed research. So it's not about having a success in the product itself or the outcome itself, but it's about being willing to take risks, to do things, and work on things, and put wild and crazy ideas forth, or very subtle things forth that have a very large impact on how we do things. This is Magnus Larsson a couple of years ago. He's going to have an exhibition up here. He actually did this Holcim award for the global sustainability. And we're going to try to enter our projects in this later on in the year. Okay, we've done lots of projects, DIP 16. I'm not going to go through them. You might be familiar with some of them. There are many of them. And yes. And for us, this is us, Andrew and I. We work in a place called Urban Future Organization. We do many projects of varying quality. And I think this is what's important, because we think production is where you actually learn. When you learn about quality, you learn about experiments, you learn both about successes and failures. And we go from making very, very small things to work on crazily big projects globally, and sometimes with success, sometimes with less, but we do big projects. And we think actually big is something which is quite important. So we're actually going to go back and revisit Rem's text on bigness, which we're going to discuss. And it doesn't mean that living has to be big, but I think we just have to see living in relationship to a larger picture of society. So this is a project that we just finished in Shenzhen for a new city. I find it quite frightening myself. It's quite big, quite brutal, you know, but maybe in order to do things that changes things, you have to go big, and you have to do things differently. When people write about us, they tend to like to write about how we work, because we are not a traditional office. We work as a network with people from all over the place. I'm sorry, I got the wrong. Yes. So this is Anthony Burke's book on formations, and it's about how we actually practice, which we find interesting. So we think new forms of practice is also a way of driving innovation and ways you can discover things. So I'm not going to say so much. I think we are interested in finding a way of going from people and the way we inhabit space to looking at maybe larger pictures of cities and spaces that deals with future living. So we're actually going to start with design immediately. We're going to start designing a future living project in the first 5 weeks. And from that, we're just going to assess, develop, and reiterate this project over and over again until we're going to test it on a larger scenario. So that's how we're going to work. Okay? Thank you.